Welcome to the third tutorial in the Introduction to Programming Using Python series. In this tutorial, you will learn about Python operators, variables, and strings. We'll start with arithmetic operators, which work in Python the same way they do in your calculator. These operators look the same, except that Python uses asterisk for multiplication. To try them out, open idle and start experimenting. You can add any two numbers, divide, multiply, subtract, and Python will give you the answer. Note that Python uses double slashes for divisor function, percent sign for the remainder, and double asterisk for exponent. Now, operator precedence is the same as you would expect. Multiplication and division come before addition and subtraction. So 1 plus 2 times 3 would be 7. It is best to always use brackets as to not leave any confusion. Comparison operators compare the two things on either side and give you a true or false answer. For now, we will show number examples, but the same holds true for Python objects. We will get to the definition and the usage of objects later, but just keep that in mind for now. The first thing you will notice is that the equality operator is double equals, not a single equal. This is because the single equal is used as an assignment operator, as we will see in the next slide. So in idle, if you type 5 equals 6, the answer will be false. If you type 5 equals 5, it will be true. Same holds true for the other operators listed on the page. Please don't be shy, try them out before moving forward. Comparison operators are very important when we get to conditions and running conditional statements. There are more Python operators that we will not get to. They're more complicated and we won't need them for now. So whenever we get to using them, we'll explain them. Before we get to the other type of Python operators, let's talk about variables. This is an essential part of the programming language. We saw in the previous slide that we can use numbers and operators to do basic arithmetic operations. And we saw that in Python, in the interactive shell, it will give us the answer to those. But let's say we wanted to save those results and use them later. Or what if there was a value that we wanted to use over and over in our program? For these cases, we can use variables to hold the result or values we want to use later. Variables are essentially labels that point to the value we want. For example, in idle, if you type x equals 5, and remember I said the single equal is the assignment operator, now type x and press enter, you will see that idle prints back 5, since this is the value that the label x is pointing to. Now type x asterisk 4, x times 4, idle will print out 20, exactly as if you would have typed 5 times 4. I did mention that the single equal sign is the assignment operator, and you can only assign values to labels. So if you type 6 equals 7, idle would complain. I stress again, please experiment, no harm done, and idle will tell you what the mistake is if you make it, and that is how you learn. So generally speaking, and as a matter of convention, variable names would start with a lowercase letter, and always it's recommended to use a name that makes sense to the value you're storing. So for example, if I wanted to store the number of milliseconds in a day, I could call my variable nummillis in day, and I would store the value in it. So 24 hours, 60 minutes, 60 seconds, 1000 milliseconds. And if you type that again and press enter, it would show you the value. And I could use that to then define other variables or use it in other places. So the number of milliseconds in a week would be 7 times the number of milliseconds in a day. Now, note that variable names cannot have spaces and have to start with a letter or an underscore. After the first character, you can also have numbers. In a multi-word variable name, just like the one we use, the number of milliseconds in a week or in a day, the convention is to uppercase the next word and the one after that and the one after that. But the first one is always lowercase. We have seen strings before, so now let's talk about them in a bit more details. As we mentioned, strings are basically text. And text in Python can be wrapped in single quotes or double quotes. So open up your idle, and in that you can type John Smith in a single quote, press enter, and you will see that Python accepts that, and it will say John Smith. Because sometimes when you enter something into idle without an operation, it'll just show you the value that you entered. And John Smith with double quotes also works. Now, note that strings have to be defined on a single line, so if we type John, enter, if we wanted to continue Smith on the other line, that won't work. If we wanted to define a multi-line string, as you can see I'm typing into idle, you would have to define it with triple quotes. So triple quote, this is a multi-line enter string, enter triple quote. That works. And if we assign that to a variable, which we can do, so let's say I define a variable called multi-line equal triple quote, I can have as many lines as I want, end it with triple quote, and if I print it, you can see that Python accepts it and works fine. Now we can add strings. This is an operation that Python understands and operates on strings. So if we define first name as John, and then we define last name as Smith, and then if we say name equals first name plus last name, and then let's print name and see what it does. You see John Smith, and you will see that it didn't insert a space. That's because Python didn't add a space because it doesn't know what it is we want to do. It doesn't know what first name or last name are. It doesn't know that we want to add a space between them, right? This is your own logic that Python won't understand. So if you wanted to do that, you can go name equals first name plus space plus last name. And now if you print the name, it's John space Smith. Now sometimes we have a message and we want to replace a piece of that message depending on the situation. For example, let's say our message is welcome name to programming with Python. So for every different name, we should have to write the message again and again and again. Or we can do something like this. Message equals welcome plus name plus to programming with Python. And then we have to again redefine that message for every name we get. Python, of course, provides a better way through string formatting. And to do that, let's define our message again as welcome %s. And in string, if you say %s, it designates to Python that this is a piece that you want to replace with something else. So welcome %s to programming with Python. Now to tell Python to replace it, let's say we print it, print message % and the thing you want to replace that %s with, in this case name. And as you can see, it will say welcome John Smith to programming with Python. Now the message %name doesn't only work inside of a print statement. So I can go define a new variable, John message, that would be equal to message %name, and if I print it, it will say the same thing, welcome John Smith to programming with Python. Also note that inside of strings we can use multiple %s. So let's say I wanted to replace two things. So if I wanted to say the same message for multiple programming languages, I will say welcome %s to programming with %s, and now I can pass it multiple things to replace. So instead of just passing name, now I'm passing name and language. And if I go print message %, and now because we have multiple things to replace, we have to wrap those things in brackets and separate them with commas, as you can see. So print bracket message %, and then the multiple things in brackets, name and Python, it would print welcome John Smith to programming with Python. Now, %s is not the only thing that Python supports. The S stands for string, by the way, so %s, you're telling Python that you want to replace that piece with a string. There are other things for currency and numbers and so on, but we won't get to them until we have to use them. So as an exercise, create two variables, one that points to your first name, one that points to your last name, just like we saw in the previous slide. Create another string message that has placeholders, that %s that I told you about, let's call it a placeholder for your first name and your last name. And then print it to the screen so that if your name was John Smith, then when printed, the placeholder should look like, hi there, comma, John Smith. So try that out in idle, and again, it may not work the first time, but look at the previous slide and hopefully you'll get the hint. You can try different things as well and see where you get. Next time we'll be gathering user input and we'll talk about lists and maps. And just before we end, no, we're not talking about geographical maps. We'll show you the next time around. Until then, have a good time and enjoy Python.